I first wanted to start by acknowledging that we're meeting here on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to any elders past, present or emerging, and any that are here today. We obviously are all here for induction training into the health systems boards, and one of the from feedback over the years that we've heard is that one of the hardest things to be able to deal with in health is the ridiculous level of jargon and its language, and that it's almost like another language. So we're going to give you a bit of a crash course in Health 101 and how some of that all works and fits together and what that looks like. That's kind of going to be your version of being able to say, hi, how are you? I'm lost, I don't speak French in France sort of things, but it's in health version. We're also going to give you a bit of a rundown of how accountability works. So as a board, you're accountable for the overall performance of that health service and it delivering on its strategic goals. So we'll walk you through that accountability, including how does actual finance work, how does your performance metrics and everything like that work? What is it that the service gets judged on? What are the sort of things, based on some of those things, what are the sort of things for you as a board you can look for when you're trying to figure out what's a risk for us? What are the risks our entity would focus on compared to, say, the other entity in the next town over? And lastly, a quick summary of what it actually means to be on a board and that strict role of a board. Again, these are going to be a quick crash course on those three, obviously topics that can be quite large, but in themselves, this is just to give you all a bit of a introduction to this, in the same way as you'd get an introduction to a language before you travel over there, so that way you can, at least when your executive are talking to you, go, I know that you said things that I know that they're words, they are certainly all words, but I don't really understand what's going on with that, or if that's good or bad, and help you to understand how might I find out if what they've just said to me is a good thing, a bad thing, how will I question that, how would I get past and through that? And you need a bit of an understanding of that whole kind of how health works, how hospitals work, and everything in between. How many of us are here today from a rural health service board or a regional health service board? Excellent, quite a few. How many are from an early parenting centre? Quite a few. Anyone here from Friends-A-Care or Ambulance Victoria? Yeah? What about one of the metropolitan health services? So we've got a really good mix. And that also, I'll touch on the differences and some of the risks that your different services will also look at, because service mix, the case mix of each of these health services and hospitals differs a little bit depending on where they are and depending on their particular needs in their community. And that means that's going to shift the sort of things you might concentrate on when you're trying to concentrate on what are the risks for my service versus say a much smaller service in the next town or a much larger service in Melbourne. What are the sort of things that I'm going to need to understand? And there's some common things that everybody needs to understand, but also a bit of help zooming in for you. Before I jump straight in, I also want to just draw your attention to the Director's Toolkit. We put together a pretty comprehensive toolkit that's on the web. We've got a bit of a quick summary of what it looks like on your packs with you, so you can have a bit of a squiz at that and get a sense of, okay, these are the sort of things that the toolkit covers. So if you're trying to think about how do we address the culture of our organisation as a board, there's an entire chapter on that. You can have a bit of a quick look and go, oh, these are the sorts of things I should be thinking about. But if you want to better understand that, then you can go and look for more of that in your toolkit. Similarly, if you're wanting to know things like, what are my legal duties? What are the things I'm legally obligated to be dealing with? There's a bit of a summary in your on your pack there, but again, a quite well detailed explanation of your legal duties in the toolkit, both in terms of all of the statutes that you have to comply with, so things like occupational health and safety, the Public Administration Act, those sorts of things, all the way through to the old school common law that all of you have to comply with as directors, those old fiduciary duties that most of us would be familiar with, And I'll certainly give people a reminder of what that means, because that's the crux of your role as a director, whether it's a health service or any other board. Your primary role is to act in the best interests of the entity whose board you're on. And that's because that entity is completely vulnerable to you. It puts its trust and confidence in you, and your primary role is that. For every board, they'll have a particular goal that they're trying to achieve. And so if you're BHP, that goal might be a combination of securing particular resources and obviously profit. For a hospital board, can anybody give me a sense of what they think the number one output, number one goal of a hospital should be? Safe patient care. Bingo. So you've got a whole range of obligations. You've got financial obligations, you've got a set budget, you've got all of those things and all of these constraints and all of that, but your number one goal is delivery of safe clinical patient care. And that doesn't matter what your case mix is. That doesn't matter whether or not it's an early parenting centre, you still need to have safe, high quality care. We would these days even talk about that as a continuous improvement as well. It's not enough to merely be satisfied that your care is safe. That's a pretty low bar. Surely we can do better than just safe, things like that. So that's your number one goal, and you have obviously other goals around that, around your finances and around your staff well-being, and all of those things still feed into that. But if there's only one question that you're asking more than anything else, you should be thinking to yourself on a hospital board, when a paper comes to you from you before your board meeting and you're reading over it, one of the questions that should always be in your mind is, how will this impact patient safety and care? How will this improve the care for these patients? That's something that should always be going through your mind. So the toolkit obviously also refers you to the clinical governance framework that was developed by Safer Care Victoria, which is also very useful for you to look at, and we'll have one of your slides looks at that in particular, and it's very useful again as a board to give you some broad, almost topics to ask questions of. So when you're sitting there and you're looking at, thinking about what should I be asking about this, and you're not quite sure, it gives you some key prompts for you to be able to think about, oh, I should be asking about this, and I should be asking about this, and I should be asking about this. And if I'm satisfied on all of these, I've got a really good chance. I've got a really good chance that this is going to mean that my patient care is safe as well. All right, so I'm going to jump to your slides on there of health system overview, where you've got a nice pyramid diagram for you to look at. As a bit of, this is a kind of hospitals 101, and all of your services are hospitals or public health services. The one thing that often people get confused by is when they get asked questions like, who are you accountable to as a board? Because obviously the CEO is accountable to you, but who are you accountable to? You're not accountable to the public. You're accountable to the minister. The minister is accountable to the public. Does that mean you don't have to care what the public think or what your community thinks? No, of course not, because obviously you've got to try to manage that. You've got to manage what your community needs. You've got to be able to talk to them, find out what they need, find out what their particular concerns are, find out the particular services that they need. Would we just give the community what they wanted if they wanted a particular service available? Not necessarily. The reality is that one of the roles of a board and of the executive of a hospital, one of the hard things to do is often to tell the community, no, we can't do that. And that's a really hard gig, particularly in the rural health services, where as a board member you might bump into that community or that person that needed that service in the supermarket. And your role is still to say, no, we can't provide that. Why? Because we can't do it safely. And if you can't do it safely, you can't do it. And that's a really difficult challenge, and that's one of the reasons why it's not your role isn't to be accountable to the public. Your role is often to manage their expectations, because they will want things. They will want to have be able to give birth to their baby anywhere, and they'll tell you things like, women have been giving birth for thousands of years, surely we can manage this in a hospital. It's like, yeah, it was also the leading cause of death for thousands of years. And so when we're looking at our hospitals, we have essentially a caveat of, yes, we do want accessible services for everybody, but the caveat is we will provide them if it's safe to do so. And not all, most hospitals will accommodate most types of births, but once they reach a certain complexity, many hospitals are no longer able to provide that service. And you'll find a range of services like that, and that can be very difficult for the health service or the hospital to manage, but that is one of your obligations, because again, when you're looking at can we deliver this service and you're asking that question, my number one goal is delivery of safe clinical services. If that's my number one goal, how do I do that? I can't. That's one of those, again, that's that key consideration. So you're accountable to the minister, not to the public, but you do need to hear them, you do need to take on board what they're saying, and you often need to manage their expectations. The next kind of accountability mechanism for you is you're also accountable to the Secretary of the Department, and with that, that also means that you'll be accountable to her agents. So that'll be your CEOs will all report into and talk to quite regularly directors and other staff in regional offices and in central office in Lonsdale Street around the performance of that service. They'll have performance meetings that'll be looking at all of the kind of individual metrics that your hospital has and going through how you're doing with all of those. You as boards will usually talk to somebody like myself, or if you're in a rural board with the regions, most of the time if you're talking to the department it would be through the chair of your board. Much the same way as the entity, most of the time the entity talks to the department through their CEO. That doesn't mean if you've got a concern you wouldn't raise it with the department. And one of the reasons why I say that is that obviously we'll talk about the different duties that directors have in a moment, but while you've got a duty of confidentiality, you've still got a duty to advise the Secretary, and by that her agents, if there's a serious risk that you're worried about. And you don't have to worry about that idea of breaching confidentiality, because the Health Services Act actually immunises you against that any liability for that breach, because you're fulfilling your role as a director. So there's some interesting elements that don't necessarily exist, for example, in a day-to-day company board. Then when you look at your own health service, you guys are at the top of your health service. The entire entity accounts through to you, and they do that via the CEO, because the CEO is the head of the actual organisation. And underneath that is going to be all of the staff below that. Do you have any questions on that kind of hierarchy? We'll talk about what that means in terms of the more detailed accountability in a little bit. Moving on to that beautiful pie chart that you've got there, this is what health expenditure looks like in Victoria. It actually, if we were to look at the level of funding that comes to Victoria just for health, it would consume the entire state's GSP. So by that I mean all of the money that this state generates on its own. If the state itself had to fund its own health, it would consume every cent. So it's about 50 billion, give or take. Of that, hospitals take up about a third. So the funding that hospitals and health services and ambulance and everything get, that's about a third of the state's domestic product. The rest of the health funding comes from things like Medicare, PBS, those other primary health services that you'd get rebates on, and private health as well. So it's just an extraordinary amount of money that's spent on health, which is also why there's a significant level of politics involved in health. You will never be free of politics, and it's a pretty good timing at the moment. We are currently in a caretaker period in Victoria. There, essentially, for all intents and purposes, there is no government because Parliament has been dissolved. There are still ministers, but they would only exercise their powers in emergencies. And so you'd see for things like what we saw the other week in Burke Street, obviously the Premier had a role and the Emergency Services Minister has a role and the Police Minister has a role in responding to that, but they wouldn't be responding to just day-to-day things as they would outside of the caretaker period. So in that caretaker period, departments essentially run government while the ministers and Parliament are dissolved, and we're not allowed to enter into any major contracts and things like that so that we don't bind an incoming government. For you as boards, it's a serious time for you as well, because your role is to be completely non-partisan. That means no discussing anything about politics, particularly about health, even to your family. You can't take a side. You must be non-partisan. And that's a huge obligation because you've got inside information. So it's a really, really difficult balancing act. The main place that you'll see that is things like not being able to take a side, pick one side over another in conversations that might remotely be, even in the vaguest terms, public. So even in a supermarket, you would have to say, I have to remain non-partisan. You obviously can still form your own views, but you're not allowed to share that in a setting that would that might give an indication that you're biased towards one party or another. And that's something that all public officers are required to do. Looking at the Commonwealth state roles, just a really quick rundown. Again, thinking about that $50 billion-ish that the state gets. Obviously, the Commonwealth fund the bulk of primary health, so GPs and allied health and things like that. And obviously PBS medication and things like that. The state predominantly funds hospitals. The Commonwealth obviously put a lot of funding in that, hospitals as well. You might all have heard about some of the concerns. You might have even seen some of those ads on TV about the federal government and whether or not they're taking money out of health or putting money in health and these sorts of things. You hear it every time there's an election or every time there's a budget. And that's because the federal government does provide a significant amount of funding that goes into hospitals as well, and it's administered by the state. If we go to our next page, and this kind of takes us to what we're looking at in terms of the room in here, we have a pretty good variety of health services represented in the room at the moment. There's a bunch of technical terms for all of our types of services out there. Technically, a public hospital is a quite small group of services that are throughout our rural areas. There aren't any metropolitan public hospitals in the sense of us thinking about public hospitals, but there are 2 public hospitals in a metropolitan region, but they're not the same sort of public hospital as we expect when we go to Kyneton and we go to a hospital there. The 2 in Melbourne are the 2 early parenting centres, so they have specialised services. So those 2 public hospitals are quite specialised on assisting mums and babes with their, particularly with new babes, but also things like speech pathology and things like that. And across the state, you've got local hospitals and sub-regional hospitals and things like that. They're all your rural hospitals. We also have a bunch of services called multi-purpose services. The average person on the street just still sees them as a public hospital. So it's worth thinking about them like that. They're called multi-purpose services mainly for historical reasons, as a lot of these things are. So hopefully one day we'll actually turn them into, give them a name that makes sense. But it's kind of just the history of how they got there. The really large health services that you think of when you think of those really large tertiary services like the Alfred, or if you're at a region, Bendigo Health, the Barwon Health, these really big ones, Melbourne Health, the Royal Children's, the Royal Women's, these are all services you've heard of. They're all public health services. They'll have multiple campuses and often serve statewide roles. So the Alfred and Melbourne Health, for example, are statewide trauma centres who also receive patients from other jurisdictions. You can imagine Tasmania, for example, only has a population of basically Geelong, Bendigo and Ballarat. So when you're looking at that idea of delivering safe clinical services, for them, they're going to hit a wall at a certain point where they can't then deliver that because they won't have the population to be able to do that safely, and that's when that patient might then get transferred to Victoria. No worries. If we look at that map that you've got there as well, it gives you a bit of a sense of all of the different services all over the state. There's a good 87 of them all over the state, not including, we've also got statewide services as well, like Ambulance Victoria and Dental Health Services Victoria and things like that, that operate across the entire jurisdiction. There are also services that aren't hospitals, that don't have government-appointed boards, things like bush nursing centres, community health centres, services like those. Now, they're services that your entities will interact with quite regularly, but they are certainly not services where they're considered state or government services, even though they probably get the majority of their funding from the state or the Commonwealth or both. In terms of regions, particularly for our rural hospitals, it's important for you to understand the different regions that we've got across the state and to know where what region you're in, and to be able to also know who your contact is in the region. And we've basically got Barwon region, Gippsland, Grampians, Hume and Loddon Mallee region, so it's important for you to know where you are. Jumping to that slide, actually before I do that, any questions about that before we move on? This is a pretty quick crash course into how health all fits together. And we're unfortunately still on the easy bit. If we look at those current health priorities, having a glance at those, they're all going to be the sort of things that you go, oh yeah, that's all the stuff that you'd predict. Things like socioeconomic status, the kind of the World Health Organization's social determinants of health, those sorts of things, obesity, chronic disease from lifestyle, ageing population, shifting demographics, these sorts of things. They're all kind of the predictable forms of health priorities across the space. But every year or every few years, particular priorities bubble up to the surface. Is anybody aware of what some of the current focuses for public hospitals in particular, for public hospitals and public health services? What are some of the current priorities at the moment? What are the things, so we've got all of those really general things like obesity and all of that sort of stuff. What are some of the really significant issues that our public health services are trying to deal with and manage at the moment? There's a few, and you know them because they'll be in the media quite regularly. Culture. Yep, culture, that's a really strong one. So the culture of both the entity and the boards, we've seen that in things like the highlight of sexual harassment and bullying within health services. There's been quite a few significant incidents, but also reviews into that. You would recall only couple of years back where there was the review by the Royal College of Surgeons into some of the behaviour within the medical fields, and that is still something that they're working through and working on. So culture is a significant one, and again it impacts safety of your patients, because if you've got staff that don't feel comfortable reporting something because they can't report to their superior because they're afraid of them, that means you've got a problem that's not going to get resolved because no one's going to report up. This is also where the culture of your executive and your board is really important as well, because again, if people feel like they can't tell their boss bad news, if they feel like the messenger's going to get kicked every time they say bad news, then they won't tell you bad news. It's your job to hear bad news. You need to hear bad news because you need to be able to deal with it and have something mitigated or changed or get a response. So really, really important to try to encourage bad news. That culture question is critical and has been really significant in the last couple of years in particular, really strong focus. There's one related to culture that's got a similar kind of element to it that we think about, which is occupational health and safety, particularly when you think about violence coming from outside the staff. So violence coming from patients, violence coming from guests, things like that. We saw just yesterday a conviction of a man that punched a surgeon out the front of of Eastern Health, and that person, that surgeon died. So again, the idea, and a few years earlier we had a doctor that was stabbed in Footscray. So, and these are really, really serious incidents, but there are daily much smaller incidents that occur all the time. Our paramedics getting harassed or having people being violent with them when they're just trying to assist them. Again, particularly there's the conundrum of we've got patients that might be suffering from some form of cognition or capacity issues, so they might have some form of mental illness that's gone into a quite acute phase. That person still needs to have treatment, and we still need to be thinking about giving them the best, safe, high-quality care. But we also need to be thinking about, how do I do that if my staff aren't safe because of that person? So to be able to have that person safe, if you think back to your kind of lessons when you're in school and you'd be taught about electrical safety, and the number one rule was always make sure it's safe first and then go in and get the person away from, go and help that person. Don't just jump in and have two people that are electrocuted. So it's that same idea that you can't give that patient safe, effective care if the staff aren't safe first. Once everybody's safe and your other patients are safe, we can then go and give that person the care that they need. And obviously we're seeing some impacts of that from things like ICE, because ICE does have a tendency to exacerbate violent behaviour. But we're also seeing levels of frustration in hospitals just around how well staff on the ward communicate with patients and their carers. How many of us have been in hospital and been like, I'm an empowered person and I still can't get somebody to help me in this, if you can imagine if you're that person, how much harder would that be if you didn't have that same level of articulation, or you didn't have that same level of understanding of the health system? It's going to be even harder for that person. And so we see a lot of aggression occurring from that frustration, and that's something that as a board you should be thinking about, how do we address that? Because that's not an easy question. And I'll say it in that context of I don't think anybody's solved it yet. So given that, it's a pretty diabolical question. So it's how do we then improve on that? Any other key priorities at the moment?
Community perception.
Yeah, just into the mic.
Community perception, particularly from the non-English background communities.
Yep. So community perception, but also cultural representation. So I'll just repeat the comment she'd said. It was community representation, particularly from non-English speaking communities. That's particularly important because, again, different cultures have different expectations. And a really good example at the Austins in Heidelberg, it's got a large population of Chinese-born families in that area, and one of the things the Austin had realised was that they were having patients being readmitted from Chinese backgrounds at a rate that was higher than patients from non-Chinese backgrounds. And so when the board's like, what, because they were trying to look at what is this readmissions, and when they broke it down, they saw it was clearly a cultural shift between it. And it wasn't until they actually started asking the Chinese community what's going on there, and it was because in China they don't have GPs. And so people were being discharged and they didn't go to their doctor because they didn't think to. It just wasn't even something that they would have conceived of doing. And so it was this very simple step of then plugging them into a GP before you discharge them was all that was needed. But without that pause to think about that cultural impact, they were going to, it was also obviously costing them money because people were being readmitted, but it was also compromising that idea of what's the best care for that patient. The other one I think I will stress as well, again, is while I've said safe quality care is your number one goal as a hospital, it's also in terms of of issues of the day, we should still be very, very cognizant of the tragedies that occurred at Djerriwarrh Health Service, in which 10 babes died as a result of a range of failings across that health service, one of those being governance. And so the board not acting on evidence that was brought to them, not acting on things that they ought to have. But again, there were failings on kind of every level there, including from the state and from the department level as well. There's very much a everybody dropped the ball simultaneously scenario, but it is something we should keep in mind, that if any of you have a sense of confidence that that would never happen to you, then you ought to really rethink how you're looking at that. You should always be thinking this could happen to us, so that when you're looking at your information, when you're looking at the stuff coming to you, you can be looking at it with a critical eye. We are all vulnerable of this happening. We should be looking for shifts in that data. Which also, again, is that reminder that we've got some key entities for you to think about, which Safer Care Victoria was created as a result of the review after that tragedy. And they've got a key role in being able to both assist hospitals and health services with either safety concerns that they have, or even just advice on particular matters, all the way through to they've got a framework that assists you as a board to understand how you can make your health service safer. And we also have the Victorian Agency for Health Information, who provide reports to the boards that enable them to have another source of the truth, so that they're not just relying on their executive. So you can imagine for finance, you don't have to rely completely on your executive. You can ask for source information. Show me a bank statement. How do you do that with your executive for clinical information? It would seem like they're the only source. That's why we've then got something together like VAHI, so you'll see things like reports like the Monitor, Prism, Inspire. These sorts of reports are made available to boards so that they can have a look at not just their performance, but their performance in context as compared to other people, compared to other services like me. So you can get a sense of, is this number good or bad? Because that's a question that I think, if it's not obvious to you, you should always ask. So if you're looking at some data or a report that's come to you and they've said, we had 7 of these, are we playing golf or tennis? Is 7 good or 7 bad? Is it high or is it low? And it's that sort of, we had 7 this year but only 3 last year. Is that good or bad? Because if you're unfamiliar with that, it can be a higher number can be a good number, or a higher number could be a bad number, or it could be an improvement or a decline. But it is always that, make sure you understand context, make sure you understand what that looks like in a bigger picture. If we look at that slide now, it's titled Safe High Quality Care. This is actually the image that I was telling you about from the clinical governance framework that enables you to have some basic questions that can prompt you. So we often get asked, oh, can you tell us what questions to ask? And we've given you some ideas, prompts of questions in your toolkit, but it's often you'll have a problem that's novel, and the little list of questions won't necessarily give you what's the question I need to ask in this specific situation. It won't always give you that particular guidance that you need. So rather than necessarily having just a list of questions that you tick off and say, well, I asked my 7 questions and now I'm done, you need to satisfy yourself. And the clinical governance framework gives a really good set of areas for you to satisfy yourself in. So if you're looking at something that's been presented to you as a board, ask yourself, how does this affect the leadership and culture of this entity? Ask yourself, how does this impact the consumer partnerships? So our patients, how is this affecting our ability to understand them better and our ability to deliver good services to them? How does this affect our workforce? Is this going to make it harder for our workforce to do this or not? Is this going to mean that we won't have sufficient workforce to be able to accomplish what we need to do? Those sorts of things. And when we look at some of the risks and things like that that come to your entity, some of those workforce issues will come to front of mind. How does this affect our risks that we're aware of? Does it create new ones? How does this affect clinical practice, including engagement with our clinicians? Will this alienate our clinicians from us? Because remember, you'll need to actually engage with those staff members, and we already have that sense that there's some cultural issues already with those that are very, very old and can take a little while for those rusted-on cultures to be broken through. So you'll need to make sure that you can still engage with those clinicians and to achieve strong clinical practice. So if you're about to introduce something, how will this affect my ability to engage with my clinical staff? Is a legit, genuine question. And all of those come back round to how will this then enable us to deliver safe, high-quality services. And so it's just you see that's just a useful frame to be able to prompt you for asking particular questions, especially when you're looking at that paper and say you've got the toolkit in front of you and you're like, not one of these questions works. It's okay because we've only given you an example of questions there, so it's obviously then useful to have a broader set of things that can help you and prompt you. Any questions on that? That's basically Health 101. You can to be able to say, hi, I don't speak French in French. And the idea, we'll be going into a few more of the jargon in our next part now, and funding and accountability, because this is where most of the jargon kicks in. Any questions on that before I move on? Alrighty, so government funding. The way government funding works for all of government is that departments will actually go to Cabinet and seek funding from the Cabinet of the government of the day for particular things. The main items in health that governments will ask for regardless of what's going on. So, you'll have things like, someone's made an election commitment to build some hospital or something like that. Sure, we'll go to government and say, here's what it'll cost to build that thing you promised. So those things you'll go to the departments will go to Cabinet with, or there'll be some event that occurred. For example, Djerriwarrh Health Service happened during a term, was discovered at least during a particular term of government. So you then go to Cabinet as a department, say, here's how much money we think we'll need to try to address that. But regardless of that, even if everything's running smoothly and perfectly, there are things that we always need to ask for. And these are things that you'll actually notice as a health service every single year. The first one of these is what we call price. That's just indexation. So that's that idea that a Big Mac 10 years ago cost less than a Big Mac today. Same burger, different price. It's just indexation. So health services do actually increase in their cost at a higher rate than indexation. You would have heard of kind of health inflation. And we hear it every time the Commonwealth Government approves private health insurance increases by 5 or 6%. That's the level of price where they're saying to deliver the same thing as last year, no extra services, just the same thing, just the one burger, it will cost us 6% more. And there's a range of things coming into that, things like new technology, things like new drugs, things like just wage growth, those sorts of things. You can imagine if the wages are growing by, say, 3.5% per annum, that already adds on to the price because the 80% of a hospital's budget is wages. So that's the first element. The next element is what we call growth. So this is, growth is, here's how many additional people we're now servicing. So in Melbourne, it's about 2.6% per annum growth in actual humans that we'd need to account for to be able to go to our hospitals. We also have an aggravating factor in the ageing population. That's growing at about 3.7 or 3.8%, depending on the year. And so what that means for us is, particularly if you're a service that has a lot of aged care services, your growth rate might be higher than the normal population growth rate because you've got a demographic growth. So that's growth just based on, we need just to give the same level of service. So you wanted us to be able to see everybody within 30 minutes. To be able to do that, we've got to pay for the burger, and then we now need to make 2 burgers. And if you want us to still do that within half an hour, this is how much more money we need to do. Otherwise, our performance will decline, and we now takes us 45 minutes to do those 2 burgers. So it's that idea of to be able to maintain performance. So this is no improvements, no anything, just maintaining performance. First you have to get your price, and then you need to manage the growth. And then on top of that, departments will then go, you kind of said you wanted to improve on this particular KPI. You wanted to, say, reduce the elective surgery wait list, or you wanted to have a lower wait time for people to be able to access the mental health bed or something like that. This is what it'll cost you to lower that, because we might actually have to physically build another ward and staff it, or we might, so that's actually additional funds then that get put on top. And so they're the three main things that we seek when departments go to government for funding. And within that, we then allocate funding to hospitals and health services based on modelling on how many patients we expect you to see year on year. Really quite easy for us to do with the big, massive metropolitan health services, because they've got so many patients that it goes onto a nice bell curve, and we can just kind of model it and go, oh yes, you had this much last year, you'll have this much next year. Looks like we're still trying to get technology working. That's good. But what we will, this is very distracting. So while we'll have that just to get the same sort of services and that for growth, we'll also have some concerns around what's happening at the Commonwealth level, because you may have heard that because our funding comes from both the state and the Commonwealth, and there's a funding administrator and an independent funding authority and all of these wonderful things, because the Commonwealth made up about 30 agencies to do just allocation of money. That means for us as entities, we then have to try to, if we're going to go to the state government for all that growth and price, we also need to influence the federal government for that as well. That's then allocated to you guys. Like I said, with the metropolitan services, pretty easy to model. For the rural services, that can be really hard because your level of patients are going to be a lot smaller, and that's harder to model on a bell curve, because you could have something very, very simple like 10 extra births, and if you're a small enough hospital, that might be a 50% change. So what we do for very small services is we give them what's called a small rural funding model, which allows them to have a bit more flexibility in how they're spending their money. So that way they can say, actually, we had extra births this year, so we put more money into maternity, or we had less births this year, so we put more money into these subacute beds over here. They still need to reconcile that back. So you'll still need to come back and say, yes, this is what we spent that money on, and account for it. It's just that it's not allocated to you in advance as I expect you to do 10 of these and 20 of these and 30 of them. Obviously, even with the modelling, we have an error margin, but it's very precise. We'd be able to say we expect you to do 253 of them, and you'd get pretty close to that if it was a big metro. But much harder if I say expect you to do 6, and you do 10, and it's a huge increase. So it's one of those matters that definitely the funding for that is a bit more flexible. There's also areas where funding has to be in blocks because it's very much just a sunk cost. A really good example of a sunk cost type funding is an emergency department. Emergency department has to stay open 24/7, have a certain amount of staff, has to have lights on, doors open, that sort of thing. If you've got no one there today, if you've got everybody there today, that sunk cost will have already been spent. And so they'll just have a sunk cost for that ED all year round, and then if they have a big emergency, they might then need to draw on more funds to, they'll call doctors and people to come in if there's a big emergency. But in general, you've got that sunk cost there. So that's another area where the funding might not be as much about activity as it is about everything else. So that's where you've got those ideas of variable activity-based funding, which is that idea of things that will change year on year, and we fund you for each activity. That block funding, so here's your giant emergency department, you'll just have this chunk of money to keep the doors open, or here are your small rural health service grant because you need that flexibility. Even we will still need you to account for it, but there's that block, or the unavoidable demand funding of that emergency department. Another really good example of unavoidable emergency block funding are ambulances. So as with an emergency department, ambulances get paid even if they're not responding to emergencies. We don't give them money only if they pick somebody up. You know, so it's not like the pizza guy getting a commission only when he delivers a pizza. We're paying for their ability to respond to an emergency, not whether or not they respond to an emergency. And it's that idea of having kind of the standing army that you have to pay, that's a sunk cost. And then if there is an emergency, that might then cost more money because you're then asking extra people to come on shifts that they wouldn't normally have been on shift. Now, this brings us to one of the most commonly used pieces of jargon that you'll ever hear in the health system, WEES. So WEES is something that all of us will have heard, even if we're in a public hospital that doesn't even use WEES. You will have heard it referred to across the place as if everybody knows what it is. WEES is a technical term. It's got a statistical concept behind it. It simply means weighted inlier equivalent separation. I say simply because if you think about that inlier equivalent, an inlier as opposed to an outlier is something that's within the bell curve. So inlier equivalent just means a normal, average kind of procedure. Separation is just a kind of a term to mean procedure. So it's a normal, average, within the curve procedure, and then we weight it. Why do we weight it? Because things are more complicated than normal. So if our normal one is, say, around 5K, which is about what a WEES is. A WEES is a unit, like a metre. How a metre is 100 centimetres. WEES is about $5,000, one WEES. And it's a little bit less than that, but you know, that's a good approximation, nice round number for everybody to work with. So with a $5,000 WEES unit, that then you might have an appendectomy that costs about that. It's a pretty average, normal operation. That same appendectomy, though, with the next patient, huge complications. That won't be the same WEES anymore, because you'll actually need the one WEES for the normal procedure, and then you'll actually need more funding to deal with all of those complications. And so that's where the weighting comes in. Each of those different complications get its own weighting to add into that. So you'll then get funding for more than just the one average procedure. And for example, you might look at some of the weightings for those procedures can go as high as 150 WEES for just a single procedure, because that procedure is that complicated. So think neurosurgery, think heart transplants. These are really complex procedures. They're not going to be solved with just a single basic unit. The other good thing about remembering WEES is about $5,000 is it gives you a really good perspective whenever you're being asked to approve funding. As a board, things will come to you all the time. And to think of a WEES as that's essentially what one procedure, one everyday normal procedure is, that means every time something comes to you, every 5K is a procedure. And when you think about it like that, you start seeing everything differently. You sit there and you plan your holiday and you go, oh, it's 2 procedures worth to go to Europe. You start seeing everything in how many WEES would that be? It's a really good unit of, and again, that's why I round it to 5,000, because it's a really easy, quick, this is approximately what we're spending. This is how many procedures worth this proposal is asking us for. And it's a useful way of grounding you when you're thinking about risks for your services and you're thinking about how that works. The Commonwealth use an activity-based unit as well when they're funding us for health reform. They call it an NWAL, a National Weighted Activity Unit. This is just metres and yards. They're both measuring the same thing, they're both doing the same thing, but one's imperial and one's metric. So they're pretty much the same thing, they work in the same way, and they're only like a few $100s off each other as well. Their weightings come from the same weighting system called diagnostic related groupings. And all of those groupings and all of those weightings you can have a look at any time, and I'll talk about the accountability document you've got there. But those diagnostic related groupings, that's where those complexities come in. So you'll have something like, okay, this person is coming into this hospital, they've booked in to be able to give birth to their babe. Is this a standard everyday procedure? Oh no, their BMI is 45. The woman's over 40. She also has diabetes. You start adding in all of those complications. Those all add in weightings for that particular procedure so that the hospital's then funded for what it cost to manage that patient rather than merely, they gave birth, so here's the birth funding. It's a funding formula designed to deal with the fact that we're not all the same and that every procedure has its own complications and differences.
Sorry, excuse me. Do you have a presentation on this use with it?
Yes,
Is it this one?
I'm not sure. Yes.
So with WEES in that example where you've got one that's...
Sorry, could I just get you to wait for a microphone, just because we've got the webinar.
I can shout.
Thank you.
In the example you gave about a simple or a complex appendectomy,
Yep.
Does that mean that the more complex one becomes a larger number than 5K, or is it, say, 1.5 WEES?
So what it'll be is it'll actually track kind of a WEES for each of those complications, but it won't necessarily attract a whole WEES for each complication. So it might be, say for example, it was one, the gist of the question in case people didn't hear was if you've got that appendectomy and just for example's sake, say it was an average one and it was worth 1 WEES, what would happen if you had those complications? You would then get a weighted WEES for each complication. So if something was a really small complication, it might be a case of 1 WEES for the appendectomy plus half a WEES for the complication, plus a third of a WEES for this other complication. And then mid-surgery, you found out that there was this huge hernia there and you had to repair it because the person was going to die, and you go, okay, that was now another 3 WEES we had to tack on afterwards. How do we know what's going to happen? Because all of those figures don't get put into the data system until after the person's discharged. So the doctor can go through and put all of the diagnosis and then later go, oh, actually this happened on the surgical table, so we now have to add this, this and this on. And then that gets coded into a system called the Victorian Admitted Data Set, and there's a whole range of other data sets that gets coded into. But obviously just doing a really quick summary as to how this works, and overly simplistic, but it's that would have then, the department sees all of that data, and we use that for our modelling. When we're predicting things, we use that to then fund you the money that you're owed, because we might have said, okay, you're going to do 5 of those 5 WEES worth of appendectomies, and you're like, well, I only did 2 appendectomies, but they actually cost me 7 WEES. We would then fund you 7 WEES. But we might have only funded you initially on your budget, you might have only got 5 WEES, because that's what we'd all agreed to. Then after the fact, so we then reconcile that with you later and go, oh wait, we owe you 2 WEES. And vice versa. We might have said 5 and you only spent 3, and we say we're taking the 2 back. That's not a sense of it's not a disadvantage or anything like that, because you can't make a profit as a hospital or anything anyway. So it really is just funding you on that cost. Which also tells you a bit about some of your risks can come in around whether or not I'm performing above target for my WEES. If I'm doing too many procedures, I'm going to run out of money because my budget is still set. And if I'm doing too few WEES, I'm going to end up having to give money back. So these are things to be looking at of what's my WEES performance, how are we doing, are we on target at this point of the year for my WEES? Because then that can also identify, if you go back to that clinical governance framework and start thinking about some of the questions. A question might be, so we're below our WEES target. What does that mean for our workforce? Do we have a whole bunch of people that are sick? Is that why we're not delivering? Is that why we haven't been able to deliver those procedures?
Sorry, that's all good now, even if that's
Thank you. So it's that idea of that you can actually think about that WEES KPI as a mechanism for looking at whether or not that's a risk to you. Now, public hospitals don't do as much WEES. So for public hospitals, you might need to look at something more like your bed occupancy rate. Because if you've got something like aged care beds or your hours of service, if you're doing things like speech pathology and things like that, you'll still have an activity that you're accountable for, and you'll need to see, are we at target for the activity that we promised we'd do? So are we above target, meaning we're doing too much of it and we're going to run out of money? Or are we below target, meaning we're not delivering as much services for the community as we could? So it's that idea of using those targets to help you figure out where are you at, how are you performing. A really big risk for a public hospital, for example, is bed occupancy rate in aged care is a huge risk because the funding is purely based on if the beds are occupied or not. So unlike the ambulance where we pay for a standing army, over in, it sounds a bit rough, doesn't it? They're tough crew as well. For aged care beds, you only get funded if the bed has a person in it. And so given that, if your bed's empty, you're still paying your nurse, you're still paying your electricity, so that's a big risk for you. So you need to be looking at that occupancy rate because you're going to be burning through cash without getting any revenue. And so that means if you're looking at a trend of a decline in your occupancy rate, you might need to start looking at your staffing for that ward, or you might need to look at how do we repurpose that ward? We don't have that amount of clients anymore. And that those sort of discussions, particularly returning to the department and saying, hey, look, we're actually not getting that level of client. We need to shift our case mix and come back and negotiate a change with the department. And we actually have slides. So if we can just get the mic, make sure the microphone's on. It didn't seem like it was on before.
Could you just put, hi, it's Peter Lynch. I just want to, with respect, make a comment as a clinician background. That last dot point would, with respect, almost be better the other way around because it's actually the complexity of the case drives the higher WEIS rather than the higher WEIS means it's a more complex case. The people who haven't heard this before, that might sound like gobbledygook. The principle of case mix is it is clinically meaningful.
Oh, very much so.
Ratings come from clinically meaningful things, and
that's right.
Clinicians are basically on board this. So the more complex, clinically meaningful complexity means a clinically higher WEIS, not the other way around.
So just because I don't think the microphone's on, so I'll just.
Just to let people know, the microphone's not going through the PA, but it is going into our videos.
Oh, good.
We're talking to it, even though it doesn't sound like it's working, we're capturing it.
Oh, great, thank you. So just a recap in case people in the room didn't hear that, and very much agree, the whole idea of activity-based funding is that the weighting is based on the complexity of that diagnosis. So I'm oversimplifying it, but it is very much the whole idea is that the system is based on the more complex the patient, the more funding that attracts, not out of some sort of, again, there's no profit motive there, it's a genuine need for the care of that patient.
Yes, can I just ask about the second line? Clearly, if a patient stays longer because of complications, there's more WEIS. But what if the organisation is very efficient and getting very short lengths of stay? Does that impact on the WEIS?
It will, but that just means that you would then admit another patient.
Okay, but it doesn't change the WEIS for that particular individual. No, that's fine. Yeah.
So again, and remembering that it's a good example there of making sure that you're keeping that patient quality in this focus of that, because you can imagine if you had a financial paper that came to you and said, it's actually way more efficient for us to discharge patients and have a short length of stay because it doesn't cost us as much, because say for your hospital, for whatever reason, the funding that was coming to you wasn't sufficient to meet your cost. And you said, oh, look, so we should just discharge the patients earlier because we're not getting enough money for it based on how much it's costing us. Well, that comes back to, no, actually, when I think about clinical safety, I can't discharge a person until it's clinically appropriate to do so. So again, the entire system, the entire idea of case mix is based on the clinical complexity of the case and what's clinically appropriate. It's very much based on diagnosis and the view of those clinicians.
Hi, Deb Collins, Swan Hill and Ione Hospital. I hear that there's a shadow system currently that distinguishes, this is on the fourth point, that distinguishes the complexity into hospital acquired and potentially preventable versus not. So is that going to come through a WEIS language, or how are we going to see that as board members over the next 5 years?
So one of the examples there is the Commonwealth, as part of the health reform negotiations, has said that they won't be funding or will have at least penalty-type funding where they'll reduce or deny funding when there are particular sentinel events. So this is where there's a particular error or something that occurred at the hospital where essentially you made the patient sicker than they were, or at least contributed to their illness. Now, these sort of events do occur, and the Commonwealth has said that they won't be contributing funding to particular categories of this that were avoidable, meaning that it wasn't something that doing everything and working on everything you knew at the time this thing happened, because things go wrong. Patients can often be, surgery can shift while you're there, that's a reality. But if you haven't done your own check and balance, and that person's got an infection from that hospital, that person's had a procedure that was clearly not done in a way that ought to have been done. A really good example of what the Commonwealth gave was going well outside the clinical guidelines for something without a genuine clinical basis for that. And one of the examples they'd given was the underdosing case in New South Wales and South Australia for the cancer patients, and that could have potentially led to some of those deaths. So that idea of that events that are avoidable, meaning that the hospital ought to have had some form of measure to prevent that, there's a resistance to funding those. That's a really hard space to navigate for hospitals, because of course hospitals don't run on a profit, and so if there's an error they've made, even though they've made it, they've still incurred the cost of that procedure, and then they've often incurred the cost now of then fixing the error as well, and so it becomes a really difficult space for them. And in terms of the policy space around that, there's still a lot of to and fro and debate on how best that's managed, because while it seems odd that you would incentivise people making errors by going, oh, here's your $5,000 for your procedure and here's another $10,000 to fix your screw-up. So it seems strange that you would incentivise that in a sense. But at the same time, it's not really incentivising it, because it's not like the hospital pockets that money. The patient is the one that gets that care and that clinical care. So there's quite a lot of policy debate there around how best to manage those sort of circumstances. Ultimately, the main thing we want is to be able to learn from mistakes and learn from mistakes at a system level. That's the main thing that we're after from there.
Thinking about technology, is it likely that there would be any instances where advances in technology would reduce a waste value?
Definitely. We see that all the time. So when you, one of the documents we'll get to in a little bit, the policy and funding guideline goes through and tells you the DRG, so the weighting for each of those complications and procedures that your hospital will do. And some of them go up because some new type of procedure is now the preferred method, and so that particular technology is expensive and it made it go up. Others, the exact same thing happens and it goes down. So it might have been worth one WEIS in 1 year, and 2 years later it's only worth a third of a WEIS, because it's actually now a much simpler procedure than it used to be, because we've got this new technology. I'd also say that technology has also been extraordinarily beneficial across the system in reducing errors. So, for example, being able to reduce things like medication errors and other errors such as allergic reactions and things like that. So there's certainly a role for technology in reducing both errors and reducing costs, but technology also does add to costs. So it's a bit of a, it kind of depends on how much it costs to purchase that particular piece of technology and how that can then get spread out across the system.
Just a follow-up question, you might have just touched on it then, and that is the lead time for a change in the WEIS value. There must be such a time, maybe because of the purchasing of equipment, for example, would be variable across the system, I imagine.
So again, the diagnostic groupings get reviewed quite regularly. We actually had a review, so we're up to, I think, DRG 10, I think. And so that gets reviewed quite regularly and that takes into account the different technologies and the different methods that are used and those sorts of things, whether or not, because you can imagine a lot of procedures now that used to be life or death, for example, an appendectomy, are day procedures now. You know, so there's a lot of procedures that used to kill people 100 years ago that today are so routine that, you know, you're in and out and you're all good. So there's a lot of procedures that have reduced in cost, and so the DRGs are reviewed regularly. And some of you that might have been around for a couple of years would also know that sometimes those reviews are wrong. And when we had that in the last waiting round where some of those DRG weightings were overweighted for particular complications and created quite significant funding issues in the system because they're attracting funding where they shouldn't have. And then that creates this kind of inconsistency between what you've done and the revenue you've acquired. So it meant that things weren't, you know, making sense, and hospitals weren't able to quite figure out what have I done versus what have I actually, what revenue should I have attracted. And again, oversimplifying it, but that sort of thing can and does happen.
Hi, Kate Cherry from the Peter Mac Board. My question relates to when you said boards need to look at both over and under performance in terms of WEIS, in terms of our deliberations. When we see over activity, given the relatively open door policy that's necessitated at a public hospital, is there any value in looking at over WEIS performance other than renegotiating, we're doing more, therefore you've got to fund us for more?
So there's a little bit of that. So like I said, what I would say, there's a bit of an error margin. In terms of the department will usually enable an error margin of around 5% overactivity, which does usually take up most of what you can do. It will mean that some of your lower acuity patients won't get seen. Because again, so if you're getting overactivity and those patients are in triage categories you have to see right away, then that might mean the patients in lower triage categories are waiting longer. And that's something that we see a lot in Victoria, for example, the different triage categories. We've got basically a Cat 0, which is emergency. You need resuscitation. Right now, there's no wait. Then there's Cat 1. You can wait up to 30 days for that, but we also know that the reality is you'll wait what's clinically possible. So for one person, that might be 1 day, and for another person, that might be, oh, look, they're actually going to be fine for 30 days. That's fine. We'll see them in 30 days' time. But 30 days is kind of the maximum amount that a person in that triage category should wait because they're considered really urgent procedures. Elective surgery has that name is misleading. It's not elective at all in terms of being a choice. It's elective in that it can be deferred as opposed to resuscitating you right now. So a heart transplant is elective surgery. So to give people a perspective of elective surgery isn't cosmetic, it isn't people getting procedures done because they'd like to have them done. These are all of the urgent surgeries a person needs because their either life depends on it or their economics life depends on it or their ability to participate in the community depends on it. These are the procedures that we're talking about. And they're all of your hospital procedures. And in that circumstance, in Victoria, we do 100% of our Category 1, those urgent category, on time. But that does mean that Category 2 and Category 3 will suffer, particularly if we're above target on Cat 1. So will then those patients that say 3 months for Cat 2, they might be, instead of waiting 2 months, they're now waiting the full 3 months, and Cat 3 can start waiting really, really long, because you can imagine that wait time is about a year for that triage category, and because they're just not that urgent. And it's one of those things that you can imagine every time that person turns up, if a Cat 1 turned up on the same day, we'd be like, sorry, we have to bump you again because you're not urgent enough. This person will die in 30 days, you won't. And so that's the idea of triage. Everybody will be able to have their procedure, but triage will always treat the most urgent patient first. Case mix funding has limitations. won't actually deal with everybody perfectly. The DRGs won't always perfectly manage every patient. There will be people that are outside of bell curves. There will be people that don't fit properly within that, that you can't average out and things like that. It might be that all of your patients have a particular complication that means that you're never getting enough funding for that particular procedure because all of your patients are obese, for example. And if you're in a demographic where they're all obese and you're always having that complication, it may not end up paying for the whole amount. And so WEAST does have limitations. And again, I talked about that small rural funding model where WEAST doesn't work at all because it still needs some degree of modelling behind it to manage that. And it needs that idea of economies of scale that sometimes the rurals don't have. And so you can't necessarily get that to work perfectly.
Excuse me. What's the threshold for the
Just one sec for the microphone. Sorry.
What's the threshold for the rural funding? What determines, is it their turnover or population? What determines that?
So yes, it's going to be just the size of the actual service and its population, so its catchment and things like that. So we've got quite a huge variety of sizes of services, everything from a small rural that could have a throughput of around 5 to 10 million. So that's a very small service. Through to say Monash Health, who has a revenue throughput of about 3 billion. So really opposing ends of the scale. And you can imagine the economies of scale that Monash could do that small rural could just never buy at that level of buying power, which is where we actually come to HPV. So one of the things that was figured out some time ago in Victoria is that capitalism doesn't really work for health. It's an essential service. And capitalism likes bending things over barrels. So your captured audience, you have to have it, you have to have bandages, you have to have prosthetics, you have to have these things, and capitalism has essentially failed that particular scenario. So what we've created is an entity called Health Purchasing Victoria that purchases things on behalf of the state, on behalf of most health services. And if you are entering into some contracts yourself or looking at procuring something like you're trying to get food services or you're trying to get your laundry services and those sorts of things, or you're trying to a particular equipment or things like that your service needs, have a chat with Health Purchasing Victoria because they can assist you with those sort of both the contracts themselves, or they might even be a supplier of those. There are some things that you're required to have Health Purchasing Victoria purchase for you. So some things you don't have a choice, and that's because the legislation has actually given HPV the power to do that, because as a state, we're trying to monitor that entire third of our gross state product being spent on hospitals. So we'll enter into a contract for the whole state for, say, electricity. Because there's no point each little hospital trying to negotiate with their electricity provider. We can get a much better price if we go, here's the whole state. That doesn't mean that we're still not going to pay for the increases of electricity prices, but it does mean that as a state, we can buy that for a better price than an individual little service can. And you could imagine that some of the bigger services might be able to still get a competitive rate, but if you're a small hospital, you probably wouldn't be able to get a rate anywhere near as competitive as what the state could get for you. And we then just play the different companies off each other as any commercial entity would. And we get them to give us the best price and do that way rather than trying to have hospitals trying to negotiate with their lower power. So that's, again, a crash course in funding, but one of the things that will help you understand how some of the other funding is the accountability mechanisms for funding. Any other questions on funding before I move on? One of the documents that I'll talk about in here you'll find very, very helpful to help you again understand some of those funding things as well. And it's useful to be familiar with the particular funding types that you have in your service. Because every service has their own case mix, so mixture of services. And so if you go and have a look at your mixture of services and have a look at the sort of complications that are common to your service, that's really useful for you. Mike?
you've talked about the funding for the services, but what about some of the, you know, capital works, like, you know, outside, that's indirectly related to, how does that gets funded?
Yep, so that's similar to when I was talking about government departments will go to Cabinet and seek funding. Some of that's going to be things like capital that might be from an election commitment. Others will be from a hospital coming to us and saying, this thing's falling apart, we need that repaired, or we need this, we need some money for that. In that case, you can then come to department and plead your case, and we'll then take that case to Cabinet for you and seek those funds. That'll all be on merits of the case, because again, you've got to imagine whenever Cabinet's looking at what they're going to spend their budget on each year, the purse is about this big and the demand on the purse is about that big. So everything gets triaged within that as well. But capital funding is certainly sought that way. And there's also two types of capital funding. You've got your kind of major capital, which is building a whole new ward or a whole building, those sorts of things. There's also minor capital. So that might be clinical equipment, or it might be just even getting your boiler fixed, or it might, you know, those sorts of things as well. Hospitals also are expected within WEAS, the idea that WEAS doesn't just cover the cost of the procedure, but it covers other things linked into that. So it covers things like there's meant to be a bit of a woven into that, the idea of it costs money to maintain the building. And so a lot of your maintenance costs should be coming out of your bottom line budget.
Yes, Melbourne Martinson, Northern Health. Can you explain further how you actually categorize the health services? Some hospitals, some health services get bigger funding than the others, and there are geographical areas that have, you know, more needs, socio-demographic, like the northern region, for example. But then our category is a bit, you know, lower than some of the big ones. So can you explain? And also KPI performance, I know, is one of the factors that are considered.
So again, the funding's allocated based on those kind of demand equations. So based on that modelling of how many people we expect to be admitted to your hospital each year, how many we expect to turn up right at your front door unexpected, like at your emergency department or your urgent care centre, those kind of walk-ins, but also people that are on that more planned elective surgery where they're actually being referred and put onto a list and things like that. So you'll be funded based on that, but you won't be funded to see every patient that turns up. The reality of the public health system is that, in a sense, there's an arms race. If you were to fund enough to have the entire elective surgery waiting list go to zero, it would just refill again because more people would turn up. And it's one of those things that there's never going to be. You could spend the entire country's GDP in Victoria and it would absorb it, because that's just the nature of that space. So each health service is funded based on that modelling of their demographic, on the growth of their population, and on the growth of their needs, and that's negotiated with their with that service. So it's not a set thing that's just, here's your number, that's it, that's all you're getting. A modelled budget is provided, and then that service negotiates with the department for that final budget based on that service's needs. So there is a negotiation path, but that's part of this, our next bit on our accountability, that we'll talk about where that contractual negotiation kicks in. So to daunt you a little bit, this is the legislation that you're required to comply with, and that's not exhaustive. That's just the main ones. So the main acts that you'll be most familiar with is if you're a public health service or a public hospital or a multi-purpose service, you will need to be compliant with the Health Services Act. If you're on the Ambulance Victoria Board, you will need to be aware of the Ambulance Services Act, and if you're on the Forensic Care Board, you will need to be aware of the Mental Health Act, or if you are an entity that admits mental health patients, you will also need to be aware of the Mental Health Act. Again, with that, if you admit mental health patients, particularly mental health patients that might be having an acute episode, you would also need to be aware of the Crimes Mental Impairment legislation, which talks about when is a person mentally impaired enough, and when do you need to actually restrain them and take them into custody and things like that. The Health Records Act is something that all of the boards need to be aware of. If you think about the kind of basic privacy principles that exist in public sector in general, Health Records Act is a bit tighter again, because obviously these are particularly sensitive records. So you think about, if this is the normal kind of commercial privacy setting, it's a bit harsher for the public setting where we've got stricter rules, and then a bit harsher again for health records. And then it's an interesting scenario. It would be interesting to know whether or not, for example, the e-health record that the Commonwealth introduced, whether or not that complies with the Health Records Act. That would be an interesting exercise. Other really key legislation that you need to be aware of is the Financial Management Act. This is where a lot of your audit obligations come from, your finance obligations come from. Coming off that are directions from the Minister for Finance. So the board needs to be familiar with this Act and its requirements. You don't need to read the Act. You don't need to read all of the Minister's directions. But for example, your Audit Committee Chair should have read the guidance on audit committees and should be aware of the obligations of that and be able to advise the board on that. You should be aware of your financial obligations, and that includes things like your annual reporting obligations. It includes things like your financial public reporting obligations. There's a range of staff safety and integrity type obligations there, from the Public Administration Act, the Ombudsman Act, IBAC. Corruption within your health service is reportable to IBAC. Protected Disclosures Act is the new version of the whistleblower protections. So if there is corruption or integrity failings in your service, you can contact the Victorian Public Sector Commission or IBAC and report it to either of those entities. As a director, you're required to, if you detect integrity failings, you're required to report those. Also your CEO, if your CEO detects any form of integrity failing, they are required by law to immediately report that. In addition to that, you're going to have a range of other legislation that affects you depending on what services you provide. So you're going to have things like aged care acts and things like that from the Commonwealth if you're providing aged care, and if you're providing supported residential service for either aged care patients or mental health patients or people with cognitive impairments or other forms of impairments, then there's other legislation that covers that as well. So it's a really mixed bag. And so, again, it's important for you to understand what are the basic things that I'm needing to comply with here as an entity, and being aware if your executive are discussing one of these matters with you, compliance with that statute should be one of the things you're thinking about. And so that's a question of, do you know if this is compliant with the statute? If they don't know, they ought to know. So it's a really quick space of saying, well, if you don't know if it's compliant, how can I consider that? Obviously, being a public service, you don't get a choice to not follow the law. It's not as closed as some of our private services, although I think our banks are learning some interesting lessons at the moment. A reminder of that responsibility where you are responsible to the Minister, so you account to the Minister. The CEO is accountable to you. You hire the CEO, you fire the CEO, you performance manage the CEO. Your relationship with the CEO needs to be entirely independent. You're not friends. But you must be respectful. You've got to work with this person. And again, remember those ideas of culture of the board. You don't want that CEO to not want to bring you bad news. So one of the things that we find, particularly in some areas, is that sometimes if you've come in and you've got some newer board members and a CEO who's been there for a very long time, that CEO can be kind of running the board. Yeah, you need to shift that relationship and make sure the CEO knows their place within that. And the main conduit between that is between the chairperson and the CEO. And if you're concerned that that's not happening, that's something you need to talk to your chair about. And if you can't get any joy from that, you might need to talk to the department about that. Because that, again, it's the board who hires the CEO. You're the CEO's boss. That being said, there is limits into what you should be doing. So it's not for you to be looking at all of the operational matters. If you're the lawyer on the board, you're not the legal counsel for that entity. If you're the accountant on the board, you're not the CFO. If you're the clinician on the board, you're not their chief medical officer. You're all directors. All of you have the same responsibility. That person, that expertise that you're bringing to that board is there to help the rest of the board understand those things when it comes to them that needs a bit of translation. So if a piece comes up that's about some litigation, or if there's something that comes up around some legislative compliance, get the person who speaks legalese to translate for you. They're an interpreter. The clinician helps as being an interpreter, but it's still your responsibility. And again, if you think back to, I'm not sure if people are aware of the Centro case a few years ago. This was during the GFC, where you had this large investment firm that did a lot of debt selling and things like that, and they were running some of the large shopping centres in Melbourne and things like that as well. I think they were running the one down Southland, I think they were running at the time. And that entity made a significant mistake in its annual report that caused significant losses for a lot of shareholders. And the shareholders sued. And the board was held individually accountable for that error. And there was a particular reason why for that. So the particular error in the annual report was around the debts that the Centro were purchasing and managing. Now, I won't go into technical detail, but that's essentially, it was around the on-selling of debts and how they were acquiring them and things like that. There was an error in that part of the annual report. The reason why the board was held accountable was because the board hadn't even read it. They hadn't even read the annual report. They'd signed off on it, but they hadn't read it. They hadn't read the section about the debts. They didn't even know. They didn't see it. They didn't notice it. They just trusted their CFO had got it right and was fine. Oh, we hired a Big Four accounting firm to do the accounts. They got stuck in, CFO was fine with it, so we just signed it off. The reason why the federal court held them individually liable for the losses of Centro wasn't merely that they didn't notice that error, because even if they had read it, a lot of people said, well, look, even if we had read it, we may not have noticed a single error in an annual report's finances. And the reason why the federal court held this against them was because this was during the GFC. If it had been during a different time, the federal court said, sure, if this had happened 10 years ago, we might have gone, fair cop, even if you read it, you might not have noticed that. But the entire GFC was due to debt on selling and debt transfers and debt trade. And what the federal court said is you were on notice that of all things, of all of the risks you should have been thinking about, that was the one. And so if you didn't look at anything else in your annual report, you should have been looking at that risk that the GFC was highlighting for the entire world. And what this concept means, if the you're on notice concept, is when we go back to what I was asking people about, what are the things that are out there in the big wide world for us at the moment in health? They're the things that boards are on notice for right now. You're on notice about patient safety. You're on notice about culture. You're on notice about occupational health and safety. Because these are things that are current out in the world. It's not just something that, yeah, okay, you've got ageing population that's been happening for decades. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, we're a bit further along on that exponential curve. Great, cheers. Like, it's not something that's been dragging on for ages. These are really current issues that a court would say, you're on notice for these. I will comfort you that the Act does immunise you against liability, providing you act in good faith. But what does that mean? That means that you actually have to consider those things. You can't just not read the annual report. You can't just not read your papers. You can't just turn up unprepared. You can't just not turn up because you're not prepared. You can't just abstain from voting because you don't want to or it's too hard to make a decision. These are your obligations, and the Act will immunise you as long as you make a decision in good faith based on the information you had at the time. But if you don't, then you'd be on notice. And so you're very, very safe if you're acting in good faith. But that does mean the standard is what you know and what you ought to know. So that does mean ask questions. I'm not sure how this will affect patient safety, or I'm not sure if this is compliant, or how will this affect, how will this new model that you're looking at for changing where the patients come in and out for the urgent care centre, how will that affect the safety of our nursing staff? Because you're on notice on the safety of your nursing staff. So it's things to think about. I did make sure I comforted you after frightening you. Sorry, I'll go back. These 3 documents are your major accountability documents with the department. The top one up there is the statement of priorities. This is your contract with the department. This is the thing that says, I will deliver X of these, Y of these, 20 of those, 200 bed days of this, 30 hours of that. That's your contract with the department. This is when I was telling you about, are you on target, off target, where are you at? That's the document that says how many things you're going to do. Obviously, for those small rural services that are getting that block funding, they will have some sort of a mix of services that it's expected from them, a set of money, and they'll need to be reconciling that back, demonstrating how that's being spent quarter on quarter. But that's your contract. For those multi-purpose services, they've got what's called a tripartite agreement, and that's an agreement between the Commonwealth, the state and themselves, but it's their equivalent of a statement of priorities. Early parenting centres have a health services agreement, same deal, it's their contract with government. That statement of priorities will include all of your funding sources that you get that gets funded through the state, even the things that are funded by the Commonwealth that still channels through the state. So you'll have in there your aged care things and everything like that as well. This is a really, if you haven't looked at your statement of priorities or your health service agreement or tripartite agreement, if you're an early parenting centre or multi-purpose service, but if you haven't looked at your SOP, and that's a word you'll hear all the time, SOP, that's one of those jargons, the statement of priorities. If you haven't looked at it, that's the first thing you should do when you go home today. Look at your SOP, because this is what your service has promised Victoria it will do. And so it's made that promise to the person it's accountable to, the minister, and the minister or her delegate that she's authorised will sign that, and your board chair will sign that, because the board chair and the board are the head of that entity. It's not the CEO, it's you guys. The next document in there is your performance and funding guidelines. This is all of the different, this is like having all of the tiny little terms and conditions. So how much money do you get per hour of that service? So you know how we contracted you in the SOP and we said, oh, we want you to do 300 hours. How much do I get per hour? That's all in the policy and funding guideline. What's the weighting on this particular procedure? Like, what's its complexity? So if I get that appendectomy with that complexity and that, could I kind of make one up and figure out what would I essentially get? Yeah, sure, go and have a look at the policy and funding guidelines. Or I think it should be policy funding guidelines, not performance. I'm not sure. Anyway, go and have a look at your PFG, and it has every single DRG. And what its weighting is, so how much of a WEIS is it worth? That particular complexity. It'll talk about whether or not it's the primary procedure or whether it's a complexity that adds on to that procedure. It'll go through all of them. You can have a look at it. It's one of those fabulous documents that you'd never ever want to print because it's about an inch thick. Because it's every single type of thing your hospital could possibly do, and what money is given with it, what formula is used to fund it, everything like that. It's completely open and public. You don't need to know this document off by heart. It's useful to have a flick through it to get a bit of a sense of, oh, I see now what she was meaning by DRGs. I get it now, great. It's useful to have a look at that, but the people who will know that off by heart are your coders, for your WEIS coders, and people like your CFO will be really, really stressed about this. So they're the people that will know this in detail. But for you, it's useful to be familiar with it, just in terms of, again, getting that logic around that. And again, really useful for you to ask, say, your DMS or your director of nursing or your chief medical officer, when they come to the board, get them to run through a couple examples of a procedure for you with the DRGs and how that might look, so that you can get a few more examples you can relate to for your service, rather than my very, very oversimplified version. A clinician on your board or one of the clinicians that comes to the board will be able to give you a really good example of how that works and how those different complications would be coming in and how they would add to that in order to be able to make sure that they're giving the right clinical care to that patient. Really, really useful to have a bit of a walkthrough of that. And the last one is your accountability as you go. So this performance monitoring framework, this is how we monitor whether or not you're doing what you agreed to do in the SOB. All of these are, of course, public documents for anybody to see, including your SOP. Your community can see your SOP. The entire world can see each and every one of your SOPs. Everybody knows what you agreed to. They're public documents. And everybody knows how you performed because your annual report gets tabled in Parliament. So there's no hidden performance or anything like that. It's very much, this is what you said you'd do and this is what you did. So looking at the SOP, we've pretty much covered this, that it's got that idea of here's your modelled budget. This is that starting point. Here's the sort of things that we expect from you. We need this data and this data. We need these KPIs from you. We want you to do this much. We want you to do X amount of surgery within 30 days. We want you to meet this timeliness target. So we might have different targets for different services based on where they're at, so that they can improve incrementally over time. So for one service, we might be expecting more from them for another, because we want everybody to be continuously improving. The other side of this is that it starts as a modelled document, and then your entity, usually via your CEO, will negotiate with us to get what's that final amount that's determined, what's your final actual budget. So the policy funding guideline will publish every single health service and their modelled budget. That's the kind of starting point, so that you guys all have certainty as to, give or take, this is what we're going to have for the year. And then you negotiate with us to get that final figure on the SOP, and that gets signed after both your CEO and board are comfortable and the department and minister are comfortable. So both parties negotiate that final point. The performance monitoring framework has quite a few domains. This was one of the things that has changed dramatically from Djerriwarrh, but one of the key elements is, again, looking at that central point that patient outcomes are your core goal. Everything else that's coming from that, having a look at your governance, your leadership, your culture, things like that. How long is it taking for patients to be able to get care? How long are they waiting in your emergency department? Do you have a good amount of cash flow for you to be able to pay bills and things like that when they come due? That's that financial management. So we sit there and monitor that. We have meetings, the department has meetings with your CEOs regularly. We have meetings with your board chairs relatively regularly as well. So we monitor those, and if we start seeing those things deteriorate, we'll start increasing the level of performance monitoring. That can be things like just contacting you more often. It can also mean things like putting things like a delegate on your board that's a representative of the minister to personally oversee what's going on the board. That person's not a director, though. They can't make decisions. They're just there to advise and to also help the minister understand what's going on. Lastly, your role is predominantly a fiduciary role. And as with all boards, you've got all of those same fiduciary duties, acting in the best interests of your entity, not having conflicts of interest, all of those things you're familiar with, but obviously that key central feature of clinical safety and in continuous improvement. That's summarised pretty much here. These are your basic duties as a director. And this is also articulated in the code of conduct that directors are required to comply with, which is from one of the other pieces of legislation a few slides ago. Public Administration Act requires particular conduct from directors. That's things like having integrity, being responsive, being impartial, so not preferring one political party over another, having robust, transparent decisions, things like that. And I think conflict of interest is one of the easiest places to demonstrate the role of a director in that space. It's not your job to declare conflicts of interest, it's your job to declare any interest. You're inherently conflicted as to whether or not it's a conflict. So you need to declare any interest that you have in the materials that have been brought to you. If you see papers coming in, you go, oh wow, I used to work with that person, declare that interest. And then the board can have a discussion with you about it and determine whether or not that is something that's a conflict that can be managed or not, and deal with that as it goes. One of the important things to think about, though, is that that idea of a conflict, when you're looking at conflicts of interest, is that the overall idea is that we don't want a decision of the board to be tainted by the perception that somebody else gained some fear or favour as a result of you being involved in that decision. Because again, you're a public entity, you're a transparent entity, and so even if there's a perception of a conflict, you'll need to manage that. And that might mean completely excluding yourself even though there's no actual conflict, but also minuting that person left the room for that discussion and came back when the discussion was finished. Things like that are critical to making sure that your decisions as a board aren't then questioned and aren't then tainted by that potential conflict. And that reminder of the minister being the person that you're accountable to, she needs to be able to, I think it'll still be a she even if we have a change of government, the Minister for Health will need to be able to trust those decisions haven't been tainted from some conflict or something like that as well, and that you've acted in the best interest of the entity and not in your own interest. I think we've already covered a lot of these sorts of things, but that corporate governance is something that is the things that all boards do, as opposed to clinical governance is the things that health boards need to do because that's their particular product. If you're on BHP, you would have corporate governance and then something like mining. Yeah? So you would have resource governance or something like that where you're looking at all of the different things that you're mining. So every board has the clinical governance, the corporate governance column, and all health services have clinical governance as well. This does mean that there's heaps and heaps of reports that come to you. Way too many reports that come to you. So how do you manage all of that? Thinking that you're getting all of these reports coming to you from your finance people, from your clinicians, from you're getting reports on your progress against the SOP. You're going to get reports about complaints that have come in. You'll get some report about, oh, we did our cybersecurity penetration testing last week and we found out that there was this. You'll get all of these reports. How do you manage all of them? One of the first things to do is remember that you're the boss, not the CEO. So if the reports you're getting are too thick and too cumbersome and too hard to understand, instruct your CEO to make them easy to understand. If they're not giving you things like trends so that you can understand what context are these figures coming in, instruct your CEO to give you something that gives you context. If you're getting reports that just sit there and say, last year we had a result of 100, this year we have a result of 150, and there's no explanation for that, demand an explanation. Have a threshold as a board. What's our risk threshold as a board? What percentage variance do we want there to automatically be an explanation? So if the number has changed, we want to know why. Or if a number should have changed, because we already had this risk come up last year, and we got asked the executive to go away and put together a solution for that, and they came back and said they're going to do X, Y, and Z, and the way we'd know that was going to happen is because we'd see this number increase, and that number is the same again. Get an explanation. Why is that? What are we doing about that? How will I monitor that you're now actually putting that in place? So variance and context are some of the key things for you to look out for. Where are there changes and where are they changed within a context? Are they improving or are they getting worse? What's going on there? Is this a one-off blip or is this something that's actually a trend that's actually concerning for you or really pleasing for you? If it's really good, how do we apply this to other spaces? So those ideas of context are really critical for you, and again, you can then use things like the reports that come from VAHI, the Victorian Agency for Health Information, to assist in giving you a bit better perspective again on some of those matters, because it can help you see how other agencies are performing in this space. And so your role as a board is to detect that issue. That's that idea of the variance, or I'm doing worse than a like service. Why are we doing really bad when the service in the next town's doing really good on this? What's going on with us? It might be that your risk cohort is really high and theirs isn't. There might be a really good reason, but there might not be. And so you should think about what does that mean? And so you should be thinking about, and even if you have got a higher risk cohort, what could we do about that? Is there something that we can do to actually reduce that risk of that cohort? A really good example there was when we were responding to the Hazelwood mine fire and looking at all of the people in the towns that were affected and finding these really alarming levels of carbon monoxide in their blood. And we were really very worried about it as a health department, because we'd set up this little health clinic looking at these carbon monoxide levels going, oh, these are devastatingly high, but none of us had those carbon monoxide levels, and yet we're also being exposed to the smoke while we're here in our health clinic. What's going on? We found out it wasn't the fire at all, it was the smoking rate. The smoking rate was so high in that population that their base carbon monoxide level was above all of the World Health Organization standards. And so we had to reset what normal looked like in that town, and then, okay, are you being affected by the mine fire or not, was whether or not you went above that. And it was a very difficult space for us, but you have to detect and figure out what does that look like in context. If you've detected some sort of issue, or even if it's something good, your job's not to fix it. Your job is to seek a response. So your executive and your hospital staff, they run the hospital. They're the ones that will put together an approach to be able to mitigate that. And then your job is to then go, so how will I know if this has got better? Don't just let them say, oh yeah, we'll deal with that, it'll be fine. Okay, what will it look like? When I see you next month, what will have changed? You show me, I need to know what will have changed so that you can detect, again, whether or not that problem's going to go away or not. So don't be satisfied with merely, oh yeah, we fixed that. You need to be able to account for, okay, I'm not assured that that's happened. I need to be able to detect that that's been fixed. So a reminder of those duties. I'm going to be able to let you out on time. Any last questions on this ridiculously dense crash course that I'm sure you're all feeling overwhelmed? But at the same time, and I did oversimplify quite a few things, but it is, as a board, you don't necessarily need to know it in a very complex level. You just need to be able to understand, hello, how are you? That sort of thing in health language.
Bruce Mildenhall from the INEA board. The involvement of boards in operations is a particular perspective I'm interested in my role, and I'm really interested to know whether the department has a view about a relative distance, and I guess one instance is to what level of seniority of appointments are you comfortable the board being involved in?
So I'll answer both of those questions. So first of all, your job is not operations of the day-to-day hospital. That's the role. Your CEO is accountable for that, and that CEO accounts to you. That doesn't mean the CEO is the only person who should be reporting to you as a board. Quite the contrary. The people that are specialists and the running those areas that are reporting to you on each of those issues that come to you should come to the board meeting and report to you. If you only ever see your CEO and never see any of your clinical staff and never see any other executives, that's a red flag. In general, you should be seeing the kind of the high-level stuff that helps you determine whether or not you're meeting your strategic objectives and those ideas of patient safety. Occasionally, that might mean you need more information to understand it, but you shouldn't be asking for a deep dive into operational matters every single time. But sometimes you might need to know a bit more to get the context of it. You might need to know, oh, wait, is that everybody? Oh, it's actually just the people that were from Chinese background. Okay, what does that mean? How do we... So sometimes you do have to creep a little, or ask them to try to ask your executive to get behind, figure out what's behind that and come back to you. But in general, you should be able to stay at a pretty high level. I think the AICD talk about it as nose in, hands out, that sort of thing. In terms of staff, you definitely employ the CEO. You do not employ the other staff. Your CEO employs the executive, and those executives then are the people that would employ the people below them based on whatever staffing policy of that entity. It is your CEO's role to employ those other executives. There would be potential for sometimes those people, those positions to need to come to the board in terms of what might be a financial delegation issue. Or something like that, or if it would certainly be something the board would be kept apprised of, but the board isn't the employer of the executives, the board is the employer of the CEO. Any other questions on that?
Thanks very much for this morning's presentation. I just wanted to raise, and very mindful we're in the caretaker period and it could be a new government next week, the issue of residential aged care. In fact, as usual, we spent 99% of our time speaking about acute services.
Yes.
But in fact, boards are overseeing, particularly the public health ones in the country and the regions, and to some extent in the cities, very large residential care. Unlike almost any other area of health, this is one thing where there's a big political difference, and the last government's policy was to move residential care facilities out, and so boards are overseeing those sorts of processes. This week, where we own public sector residential care and we're responsible. Next week, we could have a government with a completely different policy. So, sort of a comment. It's a terribly different, unlike almost any other thing, very different potential policy change. It's almost a comment. The second thing is more like a question. Is actually about the Royal Commission. Again, unlike any other area, there's now going to be a federal Royal Commission going over a couple of years over this area. And the question is, and you probably can't answer it, but you might be able to today, this week, but might be able to give you an indication when an answer is available, is what's the view of the department going to be about health services putting in submissions to the Royal Commission?
I'll answer that just because I'm cognizant of time. A couple of things. One, first, it's one of the reasons why as a board you need to be cognizant of everything around you, not just what's coming to you as a board relating to your health service. So election commitments are things that you should be thinking about, what that might look like for your hospital. So for example, if the current government is returned, they've made a commitment to have a Royal Commission to mental health. How will that affect your services? Because a lot of you provide mental health services. Regardless of which government comes in after the weekend, the federal government has got a Royal Commission into aged care, which will affect almost all of you, in particularly the small rural hospitals and even the larger, but those rural hospitals will have a significant amount of aged care services that they're providing. The department is already putting together a team relating to that will assist and coordinate with services for that, so that we can have a similar space and you're not all getting separate legal counsel advising, because that would be very inefficient. So the department is very much putting a team together on that, and people will get good communication on that as that unfolds. Noting that will come probably to your chairs and CEOs to then be discussed for the rest of the boards to be able to then think about from that channel. But again, when you look at those different election commitments from the different parties, even having a look at the commitments that have been put there for health from those different parties, it'll be interesting to think about for yourselves. Have a look at your SOP and what things might change. If a party has committed to moving something and privatising something, what does that mean for your service? What would that mean for you? It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just a potential change to be aware of, and that will have an implication for your service. Because again, remember, because you're accountable to the minister, your role will be to follow that minister's instructions. So if whichever government comes in next week, if that particular government has a policy position that requires your hospital to suddenly stop doing something or to suddenly start doing something, then that's what your instruction will be, and your job will be to deliver the policy of the government of the day, because you're accountable to that minister. So that political sphere is important. I'll grab this one last question so that we can all head on out. Thanks.
Just a really quick question is, if we have questions around specific health governance or corporate governance but within the healthcare sector, who can we call or talk to?
You can certainly, so again, your regional officers, you can ask them governance questions, but our team, which is board.appointments@dhhs.vic.gov.au, if you've got any questions around governance matters or how should we do this, or have a look at, flick us an email, I would encourage you to first look at the toolkit. It's very, very comprehensive and also put together based on a lot of questions people were asking. So you'll find some parts in the toolkit seem like, okay, you had about this much detail, and then you went into that real detail on that really obscure thing there. That's because we just had like 10 questions on it, so we thought we'd just address it. It was something that people were encountering a lot, and it might look obscure on its own, but when you encounter it, you'll go, oh, I'm glad that was in there. So the toolkit's very much, it's public commons. Anyone that has a board would be able to benefit from it and use it, but it's extraordinarily health-centred, and all of its examples are about hospitals, and it goes through in very good detail on how WEIS works, how aged care funding works, how all of those risks are associated with that, how they're different if it's an aged care funding versus WEIS, obviously, because aged care is funded based on those bed days, on the assessment of that person and what they need. So I'd certainly recommend going to that toolkit as a first port of call, but we're very happy to assist. Right. Thanks, folks.